Hello everyone, and welcome to my CBS BNB Full Today channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The return from Italy should have felt like a homecoming, a soft wharf after weeks of history, fashion, and fragile conciliation played out against ancient gravestone and candlelit nights. Rather, the Forrester spurt touched down in Los Angeles carrying commodity far heavier than luggage or recollections. It carried resentment that had instigated in silence, trueness that had been precisely avoided, and a breaking point that no quantum of glamour could disguise. Taylor Hayes returned believing she had eventually reclaimed her place, not just beside Ridge Forrester, but within the core of the family she formerly helped hold together. What she didn't realize was that Italy had only delayed the ineluctable. The real reckoning was staying at home, inside the walls of the Forrester manse, where fidelity was being still measured and tolerance had formerly run out. From the moment Ridge stepped back into his office at Forrester Creations, the pressure he'd compartmented overseas began clawing its way to the face. Italy had offered distraction, beauty, and the vision of clarity, but distance had also stoned his mindfulness of what no longer fit. Taylor's presence, formerly assuring and resting, now felt heavy, pertinacious, and embedded in a once Ridge had redefined too numerous times. He tried to move himself that history was fortune, that choosing Taylor again was the mature, responsible decision, the one his parents had always believed in. Yet every quiet moment alone, every late night gaping at sketches that refused to come alive, told him the same verity he'd been running from for times. He was forcing commodity that no longer flowed naturally. Eric Forrester tasted it incontinently. As primogenitor, he'd lived through decades of romantic wars between Ridge, Brooke, and Taylor, and he knew the signs of another implosion before the first crack indeed appeared. Italy had bothered him not because of what happened there, but because of what hadn't. There was no genuine resolution, no honest reckoning, only smiles for the cameras and polite civility stretched thin. Eric had watched Taylor precisely, noting the way she deposited herself as Ridge's anchor, speaking on his behalf, subtly asserting permanence. It wasn't vicious, but it was deliberate. And Eric, who valued verity above comfort, didn't authorize. The battle didn't begin as an explosion. It began still, nearly deceptively so, in the living room of the manse, where Taylor stood girdled by familiar luxury, believing she was home for good. The house had always represented stability for her, a place where her children were raised, where she formerly believed her future was secure. But that sense of belonging cracked when Eric's address shifted from drinking to bent. There was no warmth in his eyes, only disappointment concentrated with resoluteness. He spoke not as a father-in-law or former supporter, but as the guardian of a family heritage that was formerly again under trouble. Eric made it clear that Italy hadn't changed what demanded changing. He'd hoped Ridge would return with clarity, but rather, he returned equivocal, distracted, and visibly strained. Eric refused to pretend presently. He refocused out how numerous times this cycle had repeated, how frequently Taylor had returned believing effects would be different, and how each time it ended the same way, with Ridge torn piecemeal and the entire family paying the price. Eric was done enabling fantasy. He wanted peace, not another chapter in a no-way-ending circle of emotional destruction. Taylor was blindsided. She had believed Eric was on her side, that Italy had reaffirmed their participated belief that she and Ridge were meant to be. Hearing else felt like treason concentrated on demotion. She tried to justify her place, reminding him of her offerings, her fidelity, the time she had spent loving Ridge unconditionally. But Eric was unmoved. To him, love without verity wasn't noble, it was dangerous. And the verity, as he saw it, was that Taylor was adhering to an interpretation of Ridge that no longer was. When Ridge eventually joined the battle, the atmosphere shifted from tense to combustive. He walked into a moment formerly fractured, seeing incontinently that commodity unrecoverable was unfolding. Eric didn't soften his station. In fact, he pressed harder, challenging Ridge to stop hiding behind nostalgia and make a decision grounded on who he was now, not who he used to be. Ridge felt cornered, exposed in a way Italy had allowed him to avoid. The pressure from his father, combined with Taylor's anticipation-filled aspect, pushed him to a breaking point. What followed wasn't a dramatic outburst, but commodity far more ruinous. Ridge didn't defend Taylor. He didn't argue with Eric. Rather, he fell silent, and that silence said everything. It was the evidence Taylor had stressed but refused to admit. The consummation hit her not as wrathfulness but as shock. She had returned believing she was chosen. Rather, she was being permitted. And now she was being dismissed. Eric made the final protestation. He told Taylor that for the sake of Ridge's emotional health, for the sake of the family, she demanded to leave the manse. Not permanently, he clarified, but incontinently. Space was no longer voluntary, it was necessary. The words landed like a verdict. Taylor, a woman who had formerly been the moral compass of the family, was being asked to step away, to remove herself because her presence had come a catalyst for pain rather than mending. Taylor's countenance fractured. Times of restraint, professional quality, and emotional discipline unraveled in seconds. She felt cancelled, reduced to a problem that demanded working. Being asked to leave the house represented far further than relocation. It was rejection. It was evidence that despite everything, she'd no way truly win this war, because the battleground itself was outfitted by history and undetermined love. Ridge didn't stop it. That was the cruelest part. His incapability to fight for her, to indeed protest, was louder than any argument. He watched as Taylor gathered herself, her heartache visible despite her attempt at grace. In that moment, Ridge understood the full weight of his vacillation. He'd hurt her not by choosing someone differently, but by failing to choose her at all. The fate gurgled snappily. Steffi, fiercely defensive of her mama, replied with fury when she learned what had happened. To her, Eric had crossed an insupportable line, and Ridge's silence was nothing short of treason. She saw her mama formerly again paying the price for loving too deeply, and she pledged not to let it go unanswered. The fracture between generations strengthened, hanging to resolve the family not along romantic lines, but along moral bones. Meanwhile, Brooke tasted the shift incontinently. She didn't need to be told. Ridge's energy had changed, the weight he carried now unmistakable. But unlike ahead, there was no triumph in her mindfulness, only prostration. She knew what this cycle cost everyone involved, and she stressed what came next. Taylor being pushed out didn't mean peace. It meant fallout. As Taylor left the manse, wallet in hand, the gates closing behind her felt final in a way she hadn't endured before. This wasn't a dramatic exit fueled by wrathfulness or vengeance. It was quiet, heavy, and undetermined. She wasn't leaving because she wanted to. She was leaving because the family she had tried so desperately to return no longer had room for her pain. Inside the manse, Eric stood firm but not smooth. He knew he'd done what he believed was right, but leadership frequently came at the cost of particular connections. Ridge retreated into himself, apprehensive that avoiding a decision had led to the worst possible outgrowth. And the Forrester family, formerly again, stood on the edge of emotional chaos, wondering whether this battle had eventually broken the cycle, or simply burned the coming more ruinous chapter. The silence left before after Taylor's departure was louder than any argument that had come before it. The Forrester manse, generally alive with movement, opinions, and implied power dynamics, felt hollowed out, as if commodity essential had been removed and replaced with guilt. Eric remained standing in the living room long after the doors closed behind Taylor, his expression establishment but his eyes betraying the weight of what he'd done. Leadership had no way been easy for him, but this decision carried a different graveness. This wasn't business. This was family. And family opinions always left scars. Ridge retreated upstairs, drawn artificially to the room where he'd formerly believed his future with Taylor would eventually settle into permanence. The room felt foreign now, filled with monuments of exchanges he'd avoided and choices he'd laid over. Italy had given him beauty and distraction, but Los Angeles had returned him to reality with enduring clarity. He replayed the moment Eric brazened him again and again, fading now that his father hadn't forced his hand, he'd exposed it. Ridge's topmost excrescence had always been his incapability to sit with discomfort long enough to make a clean break. Rather, he dallied, hoping feelings would sort themselves out without his intervention. They no way did. Taylor, meanwhile, drove without a destination in mind, the megacity blurring past her windshield as recollections collided with the present. She had left Los Angeles before under far more dramatic circumstances. Blow-ups, dolor, backstabbings, but this departure felt uniquely cruel because it was quiet and final. No bone chased her. No bone stopped her. There was no dramatic reversal, no protestation of love, just the understanding that she had been politely, forcefully removed. For a woman who had erected her life on emotional sapience and cerebral strength, the consummation that she had misconstrued the situation so fully was ruinous. She questioned every moment in Italy, every look Ridge had given her, every consolation she had interpreted as commitment. Had she projected her stopgap onto him? Had she incorrect familiarity for love? The questions eroded at her, eroding her confidence not just as a mate, but as a professional who flattered herself on understanding mortal jest. Loving Ridge had always been her eyeless spot, and now it had bring her further than she could bear to admit. Back at the manse, the reckoning spread snappily. Steffi arrived like a storm, her fury slightly contained as she brazened her forefather and her father nearly contemporaneously. To her the situation was simple. Her mama had been lowered and discarded after formerly again trusting a family that promised stability and delivered pain. She saw Eric's decision as cold and calculating, prioritizing peace over compassion, and Ridge's silence as poltroonery disguised as confusion. Steffi refused to accept the idea that Taylor's presence was the problem. To her, the problem was a family that refused to completely let go of the history while chastising those who believed in it. Eric didn't back down. He explained that allowing Taylor to remain under the same roof while Ridge continued to waver would only consolidate the crack. He reminded Steffi that her mama merited further than half-trueness and stalled opinions. Occasionally, he argued, love meant stepping away before further damage was done. But Steffi wasn't interested in gospel. She wanted responsibility. And in her eyes, Ridge was the bone, who demanded to leave, not Taylor. That suggestion struck a whim-whamps. Ridge bristled at the recrimination, not because it was illegal, but because it was sorrowfully accurate. For times he'd enthralled emotional space without committing completely to anyone, awaiting the women in his life to acclimatize around him. Being asked to remove himself forced him to defy the possibility that he was the common denominator in every heartache this family endured. Brooke's response was quieter but no less complex. When she learned what had happened, she felt no satisfaction, no sense of calm. Rather, she endured a familiar dread. She had been then ahead, standing amid the wreckage of Ridge and Taylor's undetermined bond, knowing that she'd inescapably be pulled back into the chaos whether she wanted to be or not. Brooke had spent times trying to grow beyond this triangle, to define herself singly of Ridge's vacillation. Yet the history had a way of rejuvenating itself just when she believed she had moved on. She saw Ridge latterly that evening, noting the prostration etched into his face, the way he avoided her eyes as if shamed. Brooke understood that look. It was the look of a man who had failed someone he watched about and didn't yet know how to make it right. She wanted to console him, but she held back, fating that any closeness now would only complicate matters further. Brooke was tired of being the unintentional prize in a war she no way asked to fight again. As night fell, Taylor eventually stopped driving. She checked into a hostel overlooking the megacity she had formerly called home, standing at the window as the lights flitted below. Los Angeles had always represented possibility for her. Love, family, purpose. Now it felt indifferent, unmoved by her pain. She unloaded sluggishly, each point a memorial of the life she had believed she was rebuilding. The consummation that she no longer knew where she belonged settled heavily on her casket. Alone with her studies, Taylor began to reframe the narrative she had cleaved to for so long. She conceded reluctantly that Eric hadn't been entirely wrong. Ridge's love for her had always was in the environment of history rather than the present. It was embedded in participated recollections and collective respect, not in forward instigation. Italy had revivified nostalgia, but nostalgia was into foundation. For the first time, Taylor allowed herself to consider the possibility that walking down might not be a failure, but an act of tone preservation. The following days only boosted the fallout. The family dynamic shifted visibly. Exchanges were careful, guarded, as everyone acclimated to Taylor's absence. Eric concentrated on work, burying himself in the heritage he believed he was guarding. Ridge oscillated between guilt and guard, floundering to articulate his feelings without defying their consequences. Steffi reseated herself, her wrathfulness stewing beneath the face, hanging to erupt at any moment. Meanwhile, Taylor began entering dispatches of support from unanticipated places. Musketeers who had watched her cycle through heartache prompted her to choose herself this time. Their words reverberated more deeply than she anticipated. For the first time, she was incontinently planning her return. She was strategizing how to win Ridge back or reclaim her place. Rather, she was sitting with the pain, allowing it to live without rushing to fix it. This shift unsettled Ridge further than he anticipated. He'd grown habituated to Taylor's tolerance, her amenability to stay while he figured himself out. Her absence, combined with her silence, forced him to defy the reality that she might eventually be done. And that consummation sparked a fear he hadn't allowed himself to feel before, not of losing Taylor to another man, but of losing her respect entirely. As the family braced for what came next, one verity came decreasingly clear. Taylor being demurred out wasn't the end of the story. It was the morning of a reckoning that would force every Forrester to defy their part in a cycle that had gone on far too long. Whether this moment would eventually break the pattern, or push it into indeed darker home remained uncertain. But one thing was inarguable. Nothing would ever be the same again. The pressure didn't fade with time. It hardened. In the days that followed, the Forrester manse acclimated to Taylor's absence in ways that were both subtle and unmistakable. Her presence had formerly been a stabilizing force, a quiet consolation that emotional intelligence still had a place in a family frequently ruled by impulse. Without her, exchanges felt sharper, more transactional. Indeed, the air sounded heavier, as though the walls themselves flashed back every undetermined argument and every love story that had collapsed within them. Ridge set up himself, drifting through his days with a sense of disturbance he couldn't shake. He went through the movements at Forrester Creations, reviewed designs, attended meetings, and jounced at the right moments, but his focus fractured fluently. Italy now felt like a mirage, a pause button pressed on a reality that had proceeded with brutal force the moment he returned. What visited him most wasn't Eric's battle, but Taylor's restraint. She hadn't prayed, indicted, or demanded explanations. She had simply left. That quiet quality cut deeper than any blameworthiness ever could. Eric, for his part, began to feel the consequences of his decision in ways he hadn't anticipated. Steffi's distance was unmistakable, her formerly easy warmth toward him replaced with cool formality. He understood her wrathfulness, indeed admired it, but he didn't lament his choice. He believed, maybe stubbornly, that leadership occasionally meant being Ms. New. Yet late at night, when the house was silent, he questioned whether guarding Ridge from himself had bring him his granddaughter's trust. Taylor, settling into a temporary meter down from the Forresters, endured a fragile clarity. Removed from the constant emotional pull of Ridge and the family history they participated, she began to see patterns she had long ignored. Loving Ridge had always needed immolation, concession, and tolerance, but infrequently reciprocity. Admitting that verity hurt, but it also felt strangely freeing. For the first time in times, her future wasn't tethered to staying. Brooke tasted the shift as well. She watched Ridge struggle, fading the familiar signs of a man defying the consequences of vacillation. She defied the instinct to step by, apprehensive that any comfort she offered could be misinterpreted or weaponized. Brooke had learned through painful experience that being available during moments of vulnerability frequently placed her back at the center of a triangle she no longer wanted to define her. As the family still recalibrated, the question impended, implied but necessary. Would Taylor's departure eventually force Ridge to grow, or would it spark another cycle of remorse and reversal? The answer remained uncertain, but one thing was clear. Taylor leaving the manse had shifted the balance of power, not by battle but by absence. And in that absence, every undetermined emotion had nowhere left to hide.